Well, Sunday morning, Greg finishes up the lesson and he comes down the aisle there and he says, "Hey, Tom, could you take class Wednesday night?" And he says, "We're going to be gone, and I think Joel's going to go on, and I think there's about 10 families are gone, so we're sort of a little few unnumbered this evening, so if you would, just, if you have comments, try to get my attention, and we'll try to get those answered." We've been studying in this series this past quarter on the Apostle Paul, his life and journeys, and the books that he wrote, and various different things along that line. And we're drawing that to a close. I think this will be the last lesson that we'll have in that series. It's lesson 10 if you have your study guide with you. If not, most of our text this morning or this evening will be taken from 2 Timothy. This is one of two letters that Paul wrote to Timothy. Personal letters addressing to him. I think we could sort of indicate that the first letter was probably written in Paul's first imprisonment from Rome, and there's an indication that he was released, and then he's back in prison again, and he's writing this to Timothy. And we've, talked about the relationship Paul and Timothy had. It was a very close relationship. We see that, in the various journeys that Paul made with Barnabas and Silas and things, that on the second missionary journey that he came through, and Timothy joined him and went with him to various different places. And Paul and Timothy worked very closely together. And their relationship grew, and it was, an important relationship. So when Paul is sitting and writing to Timothy, he's going through and basically talking as basically a father to a son, and giving him advice and encouragement, and telling him, to hold the course, follow the things that you know, and be, encouraged and continue following Christ. And when we start looking at there in 2 Timothy, we really want to sort of start at the back of the book and sort of move forward, to that, and hit a few different places in there just to see the things that Paul was instructing Timothy about, and why he was writing this letter, and why it was important for him to discuss these things with Timothy, and continue to build that relationship. There, the first question that the author of the lessons talk about was when Paul wrote to the Philippians, he was anticipating a release from prison. What does he anticipate when he writes this letter to Timothy there in 2 Timothy chapter 4? Really, if you turn to 2 Timothy 4 and look at verses 6 through 8, he talks about a number of things that he wanted to discuss with Timothy. There, beginning in verse 6, he says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me only, but also to all those that have loved his appearing." So what is Paul talking about in these few verses? What's he anticipating? Anybody?
Sounds like his days is coming to an end.
He thinks his journey's coming to an end. All right. Is it something that he's, sitting there looking immediately coming to an end? He sort of indicates he's got some time coming. But look at those things that he talks about there in verses 6 through 10. He says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering." What is Paul sort of indicating to Timothy? What is this drink offering that he's talking about? Anybody do any research on that? Find out? Why would Paul use that sort of terminology, a drink offering?
Maybe used up.
Huh?
I mean, he's used up. He's finished.
Finished? You know,
Is it an allusion to the sacrifices in the Old Testament, like the drink offering and the grain offering and food offering?
I think there's some indication in there, even to when Jesus was, instituting Last Supper, he talked about, this is the blood of my new covenant, and, when you drink of it, remember my death until he comes. Paul's sort of maybe making a parallel to that. As Christ was preparing to, leave this earth to be, tried and tortured and, crucified and then rise again, he was giving encouragement to his disciples. I think here Paul is trying to do this to Timothy as well. And maybe that's drawing Timothy, drawing that close, that information back to Timothy and reminding him of those things. But those little things that he talks about, that drink offering. And then he says, and the time of my departure has come. So, Paul is looking at something, looking at his departure. He knows that something's going to happen. Maybe he has been convicted. Maybe he has been sentenced. And the time is, they've sort of indicated to him that when he's going to be, executed. We don't know that exactly, but, he's well aware that basically this is the end of the road. I'm not getting out of prison is basically, what he's saying. He's saying, I've done that. And then he goes through and he talks about something there is, he says, I have fought the good fight. What's he mean by it? I have fought the good fight.
He fought the good fight of preaching the gospel.
What's that?
He fought the good fight of preaching the gospel to the lost.
Oh, he preached the gospel to the lost. I mean, he did it under a lot of different circumstances. We can go back over, I think, in the Corinthian letter, and he talks about, being shipwrecked and been beaten and being thrown in prison and various different things. And in our studies, we've seen these things that has happened to him. We know he was shipwrecked because when he went to Rome, we see that happened. So, we see that. We see that he's beaten, on his first missionary journey. He was left for dead in one place. So, when he says he fought the good fight, he fought a fight that most of us will never, ever experience. A lot of times here in this country, we've had the opportunity to come into this place and worship and not have any, obstructions to us doing that. Periodically at work, we might suffer a little bit of, ridicule or, made fun of or something like that. But in most cases, we don't have the problem. And Paul could basically stand forward and said, no matter what, when I was opposed by the Jewish teachers, I still preached the gospel. When I was in prison or, detained in Caesarea, I spoke the gospel. When I was on the ship going to Rome, I preached the gospel. Wherever he was at, he stopped and he preached the gospel. He kept doing it. He encouraged people. He uplifted people. And here he has taught Timothy as his own son and gone through it. And he's having to pour his heart out basically to Timothy and saying that. He says, and the last thing he talks about, he says, I've kept the faith. That's an important statement. How would that be encouraging to Timothy? Yeah, he's wanting Timothy to be able to do likewise. Timothy knew a lot of his hardships, knew a lot of the things he struggled. And so when he goes through that, he's basically saying this here, I'm down to the end of my life, but I fought the good fight and I've kept the faith. I haven't stumbled, I haven't tripped, I haven't, given up. I've continued to go through and press on to the goal. So, I think it's important that there. So we see that, he's anticipating his death. He's writing, he's encouraging Timothy, and he's telling him that, hey, I've done everything that I could, and I followed that. But not only that, in doing so, I know that there's some rewards for me. Because he knew what the Lord had promised. It says there in verse 8 there, or verse 8, he says, "For in the future there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, he will also to all those who have loved his appearing." So, here Paul's saying, I've done all this, I've served the Lord, I know that I'm about ready to die, I've kept the faith, and there's a crown of righteousness laid up for me. All right? But he doesn't stop there. He's not saying, well, I did a great job. He's going through and says, so basically, it's laid up for everybody that loves the appearing of the Lord. So he's given some encouragement in going through and doing that. All right? Any other questions on that first question there? Have we, I think we've answered pretty much what, Paul's telling Timothy that, hey, my life is coming to an end, and these are the things that I've accomplished, and I want to encourage you to go through and do the same thing so you can have that same hope that I have. You can have that crown of righteousness, and you can see that and you can be confident that you're going to be, judged by the righteous judge. Thomas?
Let me change the subject a little bit, but in verse 8 where it says, "He will give me on the day of his return," indicating that it's not when Paul dies, it's when Jesus returns. What do you think on that, of happening after death?
Well, I think Paul's going through here and re-emphasizing a number of different things. Remember, the Thessalonians are those that were, talking about, well, if you died before Jesus came, that's too bad. You had to be alive when he came. That was some false teaching that Paul had to do. Timothy was there. Timothy stayed in Thessalonica and had to deal with some of those things. I think it's also going through and showing that importance that, that Paul was aware of, that, yeah, I'm not getting that crown of righteousness now. It's going to be when Christ appears. And when he appears, what's going to happen? Who's going to see him? If Paul died, he's going to rise to see that, same as all the others that would do the same thing. So I think he's talking, really giving that sense of that indication that there is this afterlife, and in this afterlife, there's a lot of things that are blessings that are received at that time. So a good comment. Eric?
I got New King James. That the word "day" is capitalized.
The word?
Day.
Yeah.
Like I think it's talking about that specific day when Christ returns.
Christ's return. It's not something just, people think that, it's not just, an appearing or something, manifestation. It's that last time and Paul talked about that in other places about, that judgment coming. There in the book of Thessalonians, he talks about, the dead in Christ will rise first, and then those that are alive will rise again. So Paul's talking about that same thing and making that reference back that Timothy can make that tie to, because, he heard those things. He was there in Thessalonica. He knew the teaching that was going on. So, he was able to go through and understand a lot of that concept that Paul's trying to present to him. There in verses 9 through 22, Paul, expresses some, disappointments that he has experienced. Let's read there verses 9 through 22 there, beginning. He says, "Make every effort to come to me, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. Croesus has gone to Galatia, Titus to Demeta, and only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me. And then so we come through here. He talks about several different people. He talks about Demas, Croesus, and Titus. Here he was. He's down facing the last portion of his life, and a lot of these individuals that he's worked with and studied with and taught and has gone out, and they've gone out and taught and different things, that when he sort of needs them, they're leaving. Some of them are leaving because he sent them out. We probably see Titus is that part. Demas is one that, it says there that he loved this present world. Did he depart the faith and leave and go back? But we look, where did he go? He went to Thessalonica. Don't know all the circumstances. All we know that he loved this present world. Did he have family and was, looking, was lonesome and wanting to get back to that? Don't know. All we know that it says he loved this present world. How he loved it, don't know. There's been a lot of theologians and commentaries and various other things written on that stuff, and a lot of people take and lean that he departed the faith. I think that's something that we have to do a little study on. Demas, in other places, Paul talks about the importance he was to it. I think here Paul's just voicing a lot of disappointment and probably just some discouragement, because if you knew you're down to your last days and you've got friends and colleagues and things that have been with you for a long time and they're leaving, how are you feeling? You ever had an important event or something come up and a close friend of yours couldn't make it or didn't come, or no, I'm sorry, I got to go. I've got something else that's going on. Is Paul feeling that sort of same way? And then we have, he's writing Timothy and he's telling him to, bring Mark with him. What do we know about Mark? We talked about that early on.
He deserted Paul and Barnabas, and that also caused a problem between them.
Cause a problem. But now, evidently, that's been resolved, and Mark is useful to him, especially in this last period of his life. And he wants Mark there with him. Who's been Paul's sort of constant companion through most of his journey, missionary journeys and various things, even to going to Rome, and here he is in Rome and somebody's still with him? Who's he state right here that's right there with him right now? Luke. All right. I think it's pretty important that that he acknowledges that, and that there, and he's telling Timothy about Luke as well, that Luke is there. Maybe he's sort of indicating to Timothy that, hey, when I'm gone, here's somebody you can lean on. He's going to be with you. He will be an encouragement to you, as he's been to me.
Luke's a good person to be with you.
Huh?
I said Luke was a good person to be with you.
Yeah, for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
Not just one that he was a faithful brother.
He was recording all this.
What's that?
He was recording. He was, about inspiration for it.
Okay, he was recording. He was writing different things. We see that the book of Acts and the book of Luke, that's one of the things that Luke went through and did. He wanted an accurate rendering of what these things happened. He investigated. He contacted witnesses. He documented that information, and he recorded it. What else do we know about Luke? He was a physician. So if Paul's suffering anything, pretty good to have a physician there to sort of help you through it, get you through it. Maybe if he was being tortured or, anything like that. he had somebody that could care for him. So, I think that's important to go through and do. And as we go through there, we look at some of those other highlights there. It says, he makes a couple other comments there. He says, he says, pick up Mark when you come, for he is useful to me in my service. He says, but Tychicus has gone to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus. So, Paul's sort of anticipating things. Thomas?
I was going to comment on Luke as a partner. I think it goes back to Genesis when it says, man, it's not good for a man to be alone. And I think that's the same way with evangelizing. It's better to go out in pairs, not just to be alone. I mean, Jesus doing that as well with his disciples. And so I think it kind of highlights that, is that it's good, it shows that it's good to have a partner.
I think so. I think, Wayne could probably, indicate that too with his just recent journey. How encouraging was it to have other evangelists to go with you over to Africa?
Yeah, it's very important for the psychological advantage. You need somebody to be able to relate to and somebody to lean on.
And when you're not feeling good or some infirmities come on, somebody can pick up the slack. So we've got a lot of things like it. Thomas?
And I also want to comment on Demas. Him loving the things of this life. I think it goes back to parallels with Matthew 19 when the guy comes up to Jesus and talks about, well, how can I get eternal life? And he says to him, after you go to Paul and follow me. Of course, he lists all the commands and everything, but in the end, that's what he's saying. You're gonna devote your life to me. And right here, even though we have love for things that are in the life, I mean, you love your wife, you love your parents, whatever. The thing is no matter what, we're devoting our life to God. That's the first thing. I think that shows there too.
So maybe that's the situation with Demas. The personal things got involved with him, and he lost that first focus and went back to those things, or decided that it was more important to take care of those things than to stay with Paul. At this time, as Paul was concerned, Paul needed him, and he couldn't rely on him. All right? So, we look at those things. And there were several things that he told Timothy to bring with him. What did he tell? We mentioned the cloak. What were some of the other things that he talked about? Bring with you. He told him, bring Mark, bring my cloak. What else?
Some books and some parchment.
Books and parchment. The books, could have been a number of different things. Could have been scrolls, about Old Testament times. It could have been other letters that, some of the other apostles had written, different things. What's this parchment? Paper.
Maybe he had maybe some short notes and stuff on some papers.
Notes and papers. Maybe they're things that he'd kept track of, of where I'd been, people that I knew, things that I'd written down on parchment. They were important to him. How many of you hold on to letters or cards or anything? You get something, or you get a letter from different people and you hold on to it. I think when Karen's mom, before she passed away, she wrote a letter to each one of her grandchildren, personal, directed to it. Maybe this was some things that Paul had. People that he had direct relationship had written him letters on parchment, something that he could carry with. Why? We see that some places he had to leave quickly, right? When he was at, Thessalonica, basically they ran him out of town, and he had to leave. He had to leave Philippi fairly quickly. We see a number of other places that he was at that he had to leave pretty quickly. So maybe he had some of these personal belongings, this personal books, this parchment, maybe letters and notes from people that were, dear friends and brothers and sisters in Christ with him, and they were important to him. And here in his last days, it would be important to reminisce and go through all that, and maybe I haven't included them in prayers as much as I should. Here's something that is a reminder. We do that. We have that type of stuff that we have. We have things that remind us of different things that are important to us. There anything that you've ever left behind that you really want to get back? Wayne?
Just an interesting note, the word parchment there is the word membrana. And so it is referring to vellum that they would use, animal skins that they would use to put on typically the scriptures, especially the Old Testament scriptures. So he's probably referring to the scriptures. Make sure you bring the scriptures.
Yep. So, it's important. There's things there. Sometimes, we look at books and things. Paul was a fairly educated individual. Who did he study under? Gamaliel. Who was Gamaliel?
Like one of the leading philosophers and teachers of the time.
Yeah. So, Paul had some, documentation. And that education things helped him going out and spreading the gospel. He was one that was very well learned in the scriptures. So we see those things that he had some disappointments, and and that bothered him to some degree, because here we have at least 3 companions that he had traveled with or sent out in various different places, different times, either had to go someplace for spreading the gospel or decided to leave him for some other reason. And and Paul talks about that. Then he talks about these things that there in question 3 was, he was anxious for Paul to, anxious for Timothy to bring these things to him. And one of them was an individual, Mark. Bring him. He's useful to me for service. Bring my cloak. Winter's coming on. I need something to keep me warm. Here's where I left it. So when you're journeying, coming through, come through Troas and pick it up and bring it, with me. And then, these books and parchments, which are important to him. Paul had, he had some tasks for Timothy to carry out for him in these last days to do to it. And these things were important to him to get through. How would you characterize, or how would you discuss the relationship and the love that Paul and Timothy had for one another? Like a father and son. We could go over there to the first chapter of Timothy, verses 3 through 5, and we could look about how does he talk about Timothy when he's in the introduction to this epistle, and he's writing it to Timothy, and how does he, address Timothy? How does he, make this introduction, or, not a salutation, but a greeting, or, an opening statement? What's he say there in chapter 1, verse 3? Anybody want to read that for me, please? Read 3 through 5. All right. So he comes out in verse 3, he says, I thank God when I serve with a clear conscience the way my forefathers did, and I'm constantly remember you in my prayers night and day. So prior to that, he talks to Timothy as is there in verse 2 as his beloved son, and he talks about, that relationship and how it's beyond a father and son relationship. It's also tied into, the relationship that he has with God the Father and Christ Jesus. And then he goes through and he talks about, how he remembers Timothy night and day in his prayers. I think that's a pretty, personal relationship that, Paul's doing there. To remember a particular individual night and day. How often do we do that? Or are there those in our family and things that we remember night and day? We talk about, sometimes. Maybe we miss some days here and there. Paul evidently didn't. Timothy was always on his mind. Paul left Timothy in a lot of places that were hostile places. And Timothy was able to do things that Paul wasn't able to because of the animosity that people had against Paul. Timothy was able to stay in those places and do some of the things that Paul wasn't able to do. And he was grateful that Timothy could do those things. But the other thing that he talks about is, the faithfulness of Timothy and his knowledge of the scriptures and things. Where did Timothy get that knowledge? And where did he acquire it?
Paul laid his hands.
What's that?
I think Paul laid his hands on him.
Well, I think that too, but he makes an indication there about his mother and his grandmother.
Sure.
That, he had some solid teaching prior to meeting Paul, right? And maybe that's what Paul said. And evidently, from that, Paul had a pretty good relationship with Timothy's mother and grandmother. He knew them personally. And he mentions them by name. And he mentions the things that they do. So, he had some pretty in-depth knowledge of who they were and, what they stood for, what they believed, what their background was, how knowledgeable they were of the scriptures, and that they were willing to share that, especially with their son Timothy. And, and Paul recognized that as well. All right? And then as, Gordon was making an indication too, did Timothy have spiritual gifts?
I don't think so. I think he just had the gift of encouragement and strength to, preach the gospel, and he was a good, he had a good reputation with the.
He had a good reputation. Paul talks about something about laying his hands upon him. He makes reference to the, there in 2 Timothy, verses 6 through 8, he says, verse 6, he says, for this reason, I remind you to kindle afresh the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God has not given us a spirit of I think timid uses a word there like as being timid,
Yeah.
but of power and of love and of discipline. So he talks about spiritual gifts, the gift of God, and he talks about these three things. Are those things, do we really consider those spiritual gifts, or are those, are they something that, Timothy had by the laying on of the hands of Paul, or was it something that, Timothy just learned? Sir?
I think maybe 1 Timothy 4, verse 14, do not neglect the spiritual gift within you, which is bestowed upon you through prophetic utterance with the laying on of hands by the presbyter.
So,
So he had some spiritual
So, he had some spiritual gifts. And why, why would it sort of be, sort of inferred that he did have these spiritual gifts? What did Paul, where had Timothy been doing? What had he been doing? Where had Paul left him? Where had he sent him? Where was he coming from? Why was he out there by himself and not in Rome with Paul? What was he doing? What was Timothy?
He's preaching, and Paul, he didn't want to be intimidated, by him being a young man and being a preacher of the gospel.
All right. So, here you have the three little the gifts there that mentioned in chapter 1 there were power and love and discipline. Why is it important to have discipline in your preaching? What is discipline in the manner that it's talking about here?
Well, it's following the scriptures.
Following scriptures, do it, staying within bounds, different things. So it's important to go through and look at that. Why was love important? How's that work as a gift? And what kind of love is he talking about?
Love of the brethren.
What's that?
Love of the brethren.
Love the brethren. Loving the gospel, loving the things that they're, loving God. I think it's important that, that Timothy, that Paul's encouraging about these things. And, and he's talking about the power. There was a lot of power in the gospel. It was, it's able to change people. And Paul was wanting to encourage Timothy to use those things when he went out and was preaching. All right?
Verse 8, it's telling him not to be ashamed of the testimony of the Lord.
So go out. Don't be ashamed of, teaching. Don't let people discourage you. Kyle, I thought I saw that hand go up, Alec. But, so we have a lot of little things here that going through talking about that was, important for Timothy to go out and do. Let's see. Yeah.
When you were talking about love, 1 Corinthians 13 is a chapter on love. And at the very end, after telling what love is, all the different attributes of love, it says, now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.
So, so that's an important thing. And Timothy had that characteristic. He had that, basically advertised, as announced as a gift of God through that. Something that he needed to use and it would be beneficial to him. There in, 2 Timothy 1 and 6 and 8, he was told to kindle those spiritual gifts or kindle those gifts. What does kindle mean?
King James, he says,
Stir up, light up. You sort of have fire, when you're lighting a fire, you have a lot of kindling wood. Why do you have kindling wood? It starts and it burns and gets the rest of it going. So if you're going to kindle up something, you're adding that, things that's going to get that fire going, and you want to build that fire. You want to get that fire ablaze. And that's what I think what Paul's telling. Use those spiritual gifts. Do what you need to. All right? And then, and he talks about, kindling those up, using them, make them burn hot. And then he talks about, go ahead and when you're out with preaching, don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. Don't let people put you down. Don't let people, talk about you being too young to be out doing what you're doing. You've got that, and you've learned a lot of things from me. So as we start looking through these things, and remember that Paul talked about a lot of things with Timothy, and he encouraged him in a lot of different ways. He talks about, in another spot, about three aspects as a soldier, as an athlete, and as a farmer. We start looking at those things, and he talks about a soldier that when you go out, you're not supposed to, be concerned about the things at home or be caught up in the everyday things. You're out there to do a particular task. That soldier is out there to fight the battle and follow the instructions of his commander. He's not supposed to be distracted by a lot of different things. And then he uses an analogy of an athlete, somebody that's going out and winning a race. Why does an athlete go out and running in a race? What's he doing? He's looking to win. He's not looking just, I just go out here and sort of run for the fun of it. He has a purpose. He wants to finish, and he wants to finish first. Because what happens when you finish first? You get
Crown of leaves and stuff that will be wielded tomorrow.
or in modern day, you get a trophy. You get something that you can show your accomplishment. And then as a farmer, how does he make that relationship to a farmer? We got at least one that can answer that, I know. What's a farmer get to do? Or you raise a garden.
Plant seed. You plant seed, watch it grow,
Watch it grow. And then what happens?
harvest.
Harvest it. And if it's your garden, how many of you raise tomatoes? What's you get that tomato, you're out there watching. You just can't wait for that first tomato, can you? You want to get it, and it's yours. You can partake of that, because it's something that has accomplished, and it's sort of what you receive from it. So have that. And the way that the author sort of concludes things is he says, okay, let's recap Paul's life. All right? So we've gone through basically about 12, 13 weeks of studying about the Apostle Paul. What are some of the key points from the very beginning? How would you characterize Paul? How would you identify him? What's that?
Someone who perseveres, keeps on going.
Well, it keeps on going, but I'm talking about his, we see a transition from Paul from when he first comes on the scene. Where do we first hear about Paul?
He's the persecutor of the church.
Persecutor of the church. He condoned Stephen's death, right? And then he went on, he was a leader of the persecution, even to the point that he was arresting people, throwing in prison, consenting to their death, and he even went through to the point where he got letters from the high priest to go outside of Judea all the way up to Damascus to persecute the church. And then we have him on the road to Damascus. What happens? Huh? He meets the Lord. Had he really known the Lord before? Evidently he'd heard. He must have had questions, because what did the Lord ask him? Why are you kicking against the goats? Why are you causing so many problems? And then he goes through. And then we see his conversion, all right? Did he just sort of, stop and, okay, I've done everything I need to do and go on? But then we see him go through, and he went about preaching. He went about teaching. He confronted the other apostles, especially Peter, when Peter was wrong on things. He discussed those things with the church. He continued to prove his apostleship. He converted many. He taught under, adverse situations, and then even up to the point where he's ready to face death, he's still serving the Lord. And that's what he's encouraging Timothy to do. All right? Appreciate it. I think we're out of time, and I think Brother Seaton will take over next Wednesday on a study